Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nathan. Thank you for joining Snow Isle Libraries for the Prohibition Era in Puget Sound, Bootleggers, Rum Runners, and Roadhouses, presented by Brad Holden. Brad is here tonight to tell us the spectacular story of Puget Sound during the Prohibition era. We'll learn all about why Washington State went dry 4 years before the rest of the country and how the illegal booze trade operated here once it did. Specifically, we'll learn about the exploits of local bootleggers, rum runners, and corrupt officials, as well as an entire circuit of illicit nightclubs known as roadhouses that once dotted Snohomish County highways. Before we begin the presentation, let's take a moment to tend to a little housekeeping. During this presentation, your microphones will be muted, so please use chat if you have any questions for library staff. We will also use chat on our end to share links to any resources and websites mentioned today. After Brad's presentation, we will have time to ask him some of your questions, so please submit your questions into the chat at any time and we'll get to as many as we can. Finally, if you would like to turn on captions for this event, you can now find the instructions in chat. All right, now let's introduce today's speaker. Brad Holden is the author of multiple books, including Seattle Prohibition, Bootleggers, Rum Runners, and Graft in the Queen City, Seattle mystic Alfred M. Hubbard, inventor, bootlegger, and psychedelic pioneer, and Lost Roadhouses of Seattle. In addition to being an author, Brad is a historian and a finder of old things. When not out searching for local historical artifacts, Brad enjoys writing about the more illicit side of Seattle's past. He is a columnist for Seattle Magazine, is a contributing writer for HistoryLink.org, which is an online encyclopedia of Washington state history, and his work has also appeared in the Seattle Times. Uh, Brad has been profiled on Cairo and Como News, Seattle Refined, NPR, King 5 Evening, and various publications. His trilogy of books related to local prohibition history are available online in bookstores and here at Snow Isle Libraries. Brad lives in Edmonds, Washington. Hello, Brad, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight online for my online presentation. As Nathan mentioned, I'm here to talk to you tonight about what was going on here during the local prohibition era. In these parts, we're going to talk about the events leading up to Washington State going dry in 1916, what happened once it did go dry with the bootleggers and the rum runners and the speakeasies. And then we're going to wrap things up and talk about one of the more interesting byproducts of local prohibition, which was the whole circuit of the crazy roadhouses that existed here in Snohomish County. So we're going to get started. My presentation tonight should be about 40 or 45 minutes long. And then, as Nathan mentioned, we're going to open it up for some questions afterwards. So, without any further ado, let's just go ahead and jump right in. Um, so, the beginning of this whole sordid saga that we're going to be talking about tonight really began in the turn of the century in Seattle. And by turn of the century, I guess I have to kind of clarify it now that we're in the 21st century. I'm talking about the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, Seattle had become the vice capital of the world. And this was due in large part to the Seattle gold or the Alaskan gold rush, excuse me. So in the 1890s, gold was discovered in Alaska, kicked off a major gold rush, and Seattle quickly positioned itself as the port city for Alaska. So in other words, if you were coming from the lower 48 or any other parts of the world, and you wanted to go up to Alaska to try your hand at striking it rich up there, you would travel to Seattle and catch a steamship from Seattle that would take you to Alaska and back. So, in a very short period of time after this happened, Seattle had a huge influx of young men, restless young men looking for a good time before they could find their way to Alaska. And, there's that saying that says if there's a demand for something, a market will emerge to satisfy the demand. Well, that's what happened. So, in a very short order of time, Seattle became, just overridden with all kinds of different vice establishments. And when I say there was a lot of vice, I don't just mean there were a few saloons here and there. I mean, if you were to go to downtown Seattle, which is now Pioneer Square, every street, every block, every corner was filled with saloons, brothels, box houses, gambling parlors, opium dens, you name it. It was a crazy, crazy, wild place. And at the same time that this was happening, saloons were really proliferating kind of everywhere across the country. And this was due in large part to the railroad. So what happened there is that prior to the railroads, saloons were mostly located in urban areas, and they were connected to breweries. So breweries, in an effort to kind of get their beer out and sell it outside of the brewery itself, started opening these saloons where they could sell their own brand of beer. But at the time, beer had a very short shelf life. This was before bottling or bottles or cans, and also, transportation was limited. Of course, this was before cars. It was before railroads really took off, so they were limited to horse and wagon. So the saloons that were attached to all these urban breweries, they couldn't go out too far. So that's the reason they were mostly located in towns and cities. Well, all that changed once railroads started becoming a thing and started snaking throughout the entire country. Breweries quickly discovered that, now we can transport our product, our beer, further than ever before to reach all kinds of untapped markets. And so that's what they started doing. In fact, the first refrigerated boxcars on trains were patented by Anheuser-Busch to carry their beer, and other breweries soon followed. So what started happening here is as the trains started snaking through all kinds of different places throughout the country, the breweries followed and they started setting up saloons everywhere. So suddenly these saloons were popping up in all kinds of rural, small town places. And these small towns didn't really know how to deal with these saloons that were suddenly opening up. Suddenly, a drinking establishment is opening up in these places where none existed before. And in a pretty short order of time, they started becoming very problematic. We started hearing about stories about, men abandoning their families and spending their paychecks and spending all their time at these saloons. The rates of divorce and domestic violence increased. The rates of alcoholism and violence increased. All the bad statistics started following saloons, and they became very problematic, and they were kind of the social boogeyman of their time. Well, when this happened, a movement eventually emerged to kind of put a stop to all these places. And let's take a look at some of these saloons. And by the way, so for tonight's presentation, a lot of the images you're going to see are photographs and items from my own personal collection. I've been collecting local Prohibition historical items for years now. I have a really big collection of stuff. So you're going to see that in tonight's presentation. So let's look at some of the photographs. The first one, this kind of epitomizes what was going on in Seattle at the time. This was one of Seattle's more infamous saloon owners. His name was William Belland, otherwise known as Billy the Mug, and he owned his namesake saloon, Billy's Mug. It was one of the largest, more popular saloons in downtown Seattle at the time. And I've often said that the Prohibition era, was kind of where the Wild West met the modern world. And you kind of see this in this photograph. This was before Prohibition by several years. But you still see the Wild West there very much. So he looks like he just walked out of the OK Corral or something. As far as you see the two dogs and the two roosters there, kind of a grim reminder of what was going on. It's because he allowed animal fights in his saloon, in Billy's Mug Saloon, where people could place a bet. So it's kind of a grim and gritty place. This is a saloon in downtown Edmonds, where I live, turn of the century. This was probably in like the Main Street area, what is now Main Street, near where the fountain is. And here's the interior of a saloon up in Everett. So for tonight's presentation, since we're, with the Snow Isle Library System, I'm trying to include as many Snohomish County related stuff as I possibly can. So you're going to see a lot of Snohomish County stuff. All right, so yeah, these saloons were problematic. Seattle just quickly became a very out of control place. So a movement quickly kind of emerged in retaliation against all this, the temperance movement, with groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Anti-Saloon League, groups like that. They started out in the Midwest, but they quickly spread because, again, these saloons were kind of becoming problematic everywhere, not just in Seattle. But a lot of temperance groups became very active in the Seattle area and up in Everett because it was such an out of control place. Here is a women's Christian temperance parade in downtown Seattle. This is on First Avenue, probably 1908, 1909, somewhere around there. This is some ephemera from my own personal collection. We got an envelope from the Seattle chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And in the lower right corner is a pledge card. These were really common in the years leading up to Prohibition. And basically, a pledge card was where they would be commonly handed out at churches and temperance meetings and things like that, where people would take the card and they would sign it. And basically, you were saying, I, Brad Holden, hereby solemnly swear that I will abstain from any intoxicating liquors or may the Lord strike me down, something to that effect. Then you'd sign and date it. And this was kind of your pledge once you signed this pledge card that you were going to abstain from alcohol and avoid going into these troublesome saloons. Another thing they started doing, well, when the temperance movement first started out, go back here, their tactics were to kind of stand outside of saloons and heckle guys as they were walking in, kind of publicly shame them, things like that. Some of the more ornery members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union might actually go inside the saloon and start raising hell and breaking bottles and overturning furniture and stuff. This only had a limited success. I mean, this became kind of a burr in the side of saloons. The saloons were annoyed by all this, but none of them were closing down. So they didn't really have much of an effect in that way. So what they quickly realized is that what they needed to do is start being active on a political level. So that's what they started doing. They started mobilizing together with local churches and stuff. And one of the first things they started doing is they started holding local option elections. And what local option elections was where towns and cities and even counties could vote if they wanted to go drier. That is, prohibit alcohol within their jurisdiction. So that started kicking off around 1910, and a lot of towns and cities throughout Snohomish County went dry as a result of these local option elections. I know Edmonds, where I live, actually went dry in 1910. Everett, I believe, went dry for a while, and a lot of the smaller towns did too. I think Marysville maybe went dry for a while. So they were pretty successful with these local option elections. Here's a sample wet ballot from my personal collection. This is from Bellingham in 1912. And as you can see here, they were voting. This was to stop saloons. And as you can see here, they were voting if the sale of intoxicating liquor should be allowed to be licensed within the city limits of Bellingham. You either voted yes or no. So this was a sample ballot. And I believe Bellingham did vote in favor of going dry with this particular election. So yeah, these local option elections were being held everywhere, but the temperance groups realized that they were only having limited success with these two because there was a lot of opposition to all this temperance stuff going on in the larger cities, in the larger urban areas like Seattle, Everett, Tacoma, places like that. And the reason was because the breweries that existed in these places, Everett had a brewery, Seattle, of course, had the Rainier Brewery, Tacoma had a couple breweries there. They were large employers. A lot of people that lived within those city limits were employed in one way or another in connection with these breweries. So a lot of city residents, as far as they were concerned, if they were to go dry, that means all these jobs would suddenly dry up, go away. So the temperance movement was very unpopular in the larger cities. And the temperance groups realized this. And so they said, well, let's just hold a local option election for the entire state. So that's what they did. And they gathered enough signatures to put a state initiative on the ballot. It was Washington State Initiative number 3, the third state initiative ever held. And in 1914, the November 1914 elections, all state residents voted if the state of Washington should go dry or not. And by a pretty overwhelming margin, they voted in favor of going dry. And this was, mostly due to the rural voters in the small towns and stuff. It was rejected by a pretty significant margin in the larger urban areas, but thanks to the rural voters, it was voted in favor. Now, even though the election was held in the latter part of 1914, the law actually didn't go into effect until 1960, January 1st, 1916 to be exact. And when this happened, this ushered in the first wave of Puget Sound bootleggers. And I should clarify a few different terms I'm going to be using for this presentation. So there's 3 terms that you commonly hear when you're reading about prohibition or when the subject of prohibition comes up, and that's bootleggers, rum runners, and moonshiners. And they're often used kind of interchangeably as though they mean the same thing, but they mean different things. Bootleggers refers to smuggling booze on land. It's a term that came from the Civil War. Civil War soldiers would smuggle booze in their boots next to their leg and smuggle it into the camps that way, bootlegging. So that's where the term came from. Rum running refers to smuggling booze on the water on either a boat or a ship. And moonshining refers to making your own booze with a still, moonshine still. So that's what those terms mean. Now, as far as bootlegging goes, so the first wave of bootleggers took place right after statewide prohibition. And probably the largest group was a quartet of brothers known as the Billingsley brothers. Here's 2 of them shown here in this photograph, Fred Billingsley and Logan Billingsley. And what they did, how they started out, so there were a couple loopholes in the Washington state prohibition law as far as how you could obtain booze. And one of them was that you could obtain medicinal whiskey with a valid prescription from a medical doctor. So suddenly, a lot of people started visiting their doctor. Oh, doctor, my back hurts. I'm having trouble sleeping. I think I need some medicinal whiskey. And the doctor would write out a prescription for you. And as long as it was a legitimate, valid prescription, you could bring it to your local pharmacy, and they would hand you a fifth of whiskey. Now, I went to the Bartell's headquarters when I was writing my first book to look at some of these early medicinal whiskey bottles, and they were prescribing them the good stuff. It was usually 10 to 15-year-old aged bourbon. So you were able to get your hands on some medicinal whiskey back then. You were drinking the good stuff. Well, a lot of pharmacies, though, if you were willing to slip them some extra money, they were willing to overlook the fact that maybe you didn't have a valid prescription with you, and they would just sell you the booze outright without a prescription. The Billingsley brothers, that's how they got their start. So they set up the Stewart Street Pharmacy in downtown Seattle. Slip them a few extra bucks, and they would just sell you the booze outright. So it quickly became one of the more popular pharmacies in downtown Seattle. But the authorities quickly caught on, and the Stewart Street Pharmacy was shut down in a relatively short order period of time. That didn't deter the Billingsleys, though. They just started smuggling booze in by the truckload from other nearby states that were still wet, like California, for instance. So they were the main suppliers of illegal booze during the early years of Prohibition here for the first couple of years, from 1916 to about 1918. Eventually, they got caught. They basically got chased out of Seattle, and they just relocated over to Detroit, and they started bootlegging there. Now, a couple interesting footnotes about the Billingsleys here, since we're on the subject. So, all four Billingsley brothers, after Prohibition ended in 1933, they all became basically they went legit and became very successful businessmen in different areas and started their own families and stuff. And there was kind of a famous family tree that emerged from this quartet of brothers. I'm sure you've heard of Barbara Billingsley, who played June Cleaver on Leave It to Beaver. She's part of the Billingsley family tree, as is Peter Billingsley, who played Ralphie in A Christmas Story. He's the grandson of Fred Billingsley there on the left. And Logan Billingsley on the right, he had a couple sons really late in life, I think when he was in his 60s. And I am actually now working with one of his sons who's writing a book about his dad and his famous uncles. So the Billingsley story is finally going to be told, which is neat. And I'm taking part in helping Robert Billingsley, Logan's son there, write this book. So that's been a fun project to work. Anyway, so this was the first wave of bootleggers. In 1920, national prohibition took effect with the passage of the 18th Amendment. And again, this was largely due to the temperance movement. They just became increasingly more powerful politically, and they were able to actually, achieve the passage of the 18th Amendment. So this ushered in the second wave of Puget Sound bootleggers. And probably the biggest one of them all was the guy shown here. That's Roy Olmsted with his wife Elise. Um, Roy Olmsted started out as a Seattle cop. I think he joined the Seattle Police Force in 1907. He was very bright and smart and ambitious, so he rose through the ranks pretty fast. By the time national prohibition took effect in 1920, he was a lieutenant. But what was going on? So, police officers at the time were notoriously paid really like kind of pitifully low salaries, almost poverty level salaries. And as a result, a lot of police officers kind of had side hustles going on the side to generate extra income for themselves and their families. Some of these side hustles were on the legal side of things. Some of these side hustles, not so much. Roy Olmsted, while he was on the police force, was in this latter category of not so much. He basically, what happened is after the Billingsleys went away, he kind of filled the void of handling local bootlegging activities, and he started becoming a bootlegger at the same time he was on the police force. A few months after national prohibition took effect in March 1920, they had set up a sting operation up here in Snohomish County at Meadowdale Beach. Some of you may have been there before, just north Edmonds, south Linwood. And they set up a sting operation. They started hearing reports that booze was being smuggled to Meadowdale Beach, and so they kind of lay in wait, and they caught Roy Olmsted and his crew accepting a delivery of illegal booze that came in on a ship. So he was arrested, fired from the force, at which point he said, well, I guess I'm just going to be a full-time bootlegger now. And that's what he did. And he became arguably the area's largest bootlegger, maybe even the country's largest. He was doing this on a pretty large scale. In fact, at one point, his bootlegging operation was so big that he was the largest employer in Puget Sound for a couple of years. He had so many people on his payroll. He was nicknamed the gentleman bootlegger. That's because he didn't believe in violence. He didn't allow any of his men to carry guns. To his way of thinking, having shootouts with people and things like that, that just drew a lot of unwanted attention to yourself. And he was making so much money, it was just easier to pay people off. So that's what he did. And he was a wildly successful bootlegger. Here's another picture of him and Elise. So the way the local bootlegging racket worked here is Canada, our neighbors to the north, booze was legal up there. So Puget Sound bootleggers would hire rum runners to take their boats up to places like Vancouver, BC, Victoria, places like that. load up their ships with legal Canadian booze and then smuggle it down and they had different predetermined drop-off points ranging everywhere from Bellingham, Everett, Mukilteo, the famous Smuggler's Cove in Mukilteo, Edmonds, and all the way down to Seattle and Tacoma. Rum runners, the guys that were doing all this smuggling, they were basically contractors for hire. It was a very bootleggers would hire them, like Olmsted. It was a very high risk, high reward job, but the risks were definitely there. Probably the biggest risk was the U.S. Coast Guard. They patrolled the Puget Sound waters pretty aggressively and aggressively enforced prohibition laws, and they were pretty they were really aggressive about it. They basically took a shoot first, ask questions later approach to things. If they saw a suspicious boat or ship out on the water, they'd usually give them one warning, either flashing their lights or sounding the siren, indicating that they wanted the boat to stop. If the boat did not heed their warning, then these Coast Guard cutters, these ships, were each had machine guns and cannons on board, and they would just open fire and sink the ships that way. So there's probably hundreds of rum running ships on the bottom of Puget Sound thanks to the U.S. Coast Guard from the Prohibition era. Another big threat to rum runners was pirates. There was a lot of piracy on Puget Sound. Pirate ships would wait in little coves and inlets for rum running ships to go by, and then they would attack the ship and try to take away their valuable cargo from them. And another risk was, I'm sure as you guys have noticed here, where we live in Western Washington, there's a lot of trees. So there's a lot of driftwood and a lot of floating logs in Puget Sound. And a lot of rum runners would operate at night and in stormy weather in an effort to not be seen and avoid detection by the Coast Guard. So the risk of just, running your ship at night and running into a log or something and having your ship sink that way was a very real threat. But if they could successfully land the booze and get it ashore to the bootleggers, they stood to make a really big paycheck. So high risk, high reward. They could make a lot of money, but the risks were very real. Now, once the booze was landed ashore, the bootleggers would wait there for the ships to arrive, and then they'd quickly unload the cargo onto waiting trucks. And then they'd usually bring it to a temporary holding spot. Barns and garages were popular spots. Then they would begin taking orders from the area's speakeasies and nightclubs as far as, who wanted the booze and how much booze they wanted. Then they would deliver it accordingly. One of Roy Olmsted's biggest customers at the time was Doc Hamilton. Doc Hamilton was a very successful Black businessman who operated Doc Hamilton's, probably the city's most popular speakeasy throughout Prohibition. A lot of people have compared Doc Hamilton's to the Cotton Club in Harlem, if you've ever heard of that legendary speakeasy, because it was a very fancy, regal place. You'd go in and, they had really nice tables set up, live music, the area's top jazz bands, really good food, a lot of gambling they offered, and of course, as much of booze as you wanted, thanks to Roy Olmsted. Here's a picture of Doc Hamilton. He was described as like a very charming, outgoing, gregarious personality, very well liked. Everyone loved Doc Hamilton. He was a local celebrity in a lot of ways. A lot of people, because his establishment was so popular, and everyone knew who Doc Hamilton was. He was a very well liked figure. But what started happening here is beginning in the mid 1920s, the Snohomish County the King County Sheriff's Department and the Seattle Police Department decided that they had had enough of all these speakeasies and nightclubs and illegal drinking establishment. So they began cracking down on these places in a pretty aggressive manner and shutting them down and basically chasing them out of the city. And again, this started around 1924, continued into 1925 and 1926. It was a successful campaign because they were successful in closing down a lot of these places, including Doc Hamilton's place. Um, when this was going on, though, at the same time they were doing this campaign, car culture had become really kind of set in. Automobiles had become increasingly popular. And so they started building roads and highways to accommodate all these new cars that were suddenly on the road. And two of the earliest highways were built just north of Seattle. The first one was the Bothell Highway connecting Seattle and Everett together, which is now Lake City Way or Bothell Way, depending where you're at. It's even the state route. But back then it was known as the Bothell Way or the Seattle Everett Highway or the Pacific Highway. The other highway was, of course, Highway 99/Aurora. That came afterwards. But as these two early highways set up, a lot of businesses started springing up on them to take advantage of all the new car traffic, restaurants, gas stations, overnight motels, places like that. And most of these stretches of highway were in Snohomish County, outside the jurisdiction of the Seattle Police Department and the King County Sheriff's Department. So what happened is, as they started chasing out all these speakeasy owners, they just started setting up shop on these new stretches of rural highway. Because to their way of thinking, they'd been hassled by the Seattle cops for so long. Now they're out of the jurisdiction of these guys. And these were very rural stretches, even though they were highways, they were very rural and so kind of off the beaten path. So, in a very short period of time, suddenly an entire circuit of these illicit nightclubs started operating just north of the city on these two stretches of highway. They offered as much drinking and gambling, in a lot of cases, as much prostitution as you wanted. And so they attracted a lot of riffraff, and they quickly became pretty notorious places. Um, Now, when it came to the outside appearance, no two roadhouses were alike. Some of them looked like elaborate cabarets, looked really fancy on the outside. Some of them looked like kind of primitive shacks, as we're going to see. But they were all shared, despite their difference in how they look, they shared a lot of commonalities. One of them, again, was they offered gambling and prostitution, as much drinking as you can handle. So they were frequently being raided by the police. Here's some matchbooks from my own personal collection from some of these roadhouses. But yeah, they were always being raided. Here's some headlines from various Snohomish County newspapers that I pulled from some of these raids that were taking place. There's another one: 17 arrested on a New Year's Eve raid. Another picture there: jailed in a roadhouse raid. But yeah, these nightclubs, they started being referred to as roadhouses. Um, Now, another thing they shared is these roadhouses, and we're going to get into this more, is uh, they became top music venues. Roadhouses typically paid musicians higher wages than other places, other nightclubs would pay them. So local musicians loved playing at the roadhouses. So a lot of these roadhouses in Snohomish County quickly became the region's top music venues with top jazz bands and the top big bands you can imagine. Another commonality, and we're going to get into this too, is a lot of them burned down under very mysterious circumstances. Usually, the way it would work is, the cops were continually raiding these places, and eventually they would just reach their wits' end, say, we've raided you so many times, you keep opening back up, so we're shutting you down for good now. They'd usually arrest the owner, padlock the doors, and shut the places down. And usually, when that happened, more times than not, within a few weeks of it happening, suddenly the place would catch fire and burn down under very, mysterious circumstances. So let's talk about some of these roadhouses. The ones I'm going to share with you tonight are the ones along Highway 99. So one of the books I wrote, as they mentioned at the beginning, is called The Lost Roadhouses of Seattle. I wrote it a couple years ago. It was published. And basically, I co-wrote it with my friend Peter Blecka, who's a music historian. And We basically split the book in half, and he covered all the roadhouses on the Bothell Highway, and I covered all the ones on Highway 99 slash Aurora. So the ones I'm going to show you tonight were on the Highway 99 stretch. All right, this was the Maryland Inn, and this was one of the first ones to open up. This opened up in 1925. This was located on what is now 212th and Highway 99. There's a Jack in the Box that sits there now. There's also Harvey's Tavern. I'm sure you see in the sign. It's the one with the rabbit. It used to move its foot, but they think they got too many complaints. But the sign is still up there with the rabbit. So that's where the Maryland Inn was located. It was only open for a couple years. It closed in 1927. I don't know a lot of details about why it closed or if it burned down or anything. I just know it was open for a couple of years. But, you can see from the appearance here, this was one of the more nicer roadhouses. It looked almost, to me, it almost looked Bavarian. Like you could almost picture this in Leavenworth or somewhere like that. So again, this was from 1925 to 1927, Maryland Inn. One of the more notorious ones was Mackenzie's Bungalow Inn. This opened in 1926. This was on 228th Street and Highway 99, where there's a Country Farms produce stand now sits, for those familiar with that stretch of the road in the Edmonds area, Highway 99. This is an ad from its grand opening when it opened in 1926. There was previously a Mackenzie's Bungalow Inn on the Bothell Highway, but they got closed down, and so Mackenzie, the owner, just simply moved his operation and opened one here on Highway 99. You can see from the picture here, it was kind of a roundish building with a sloped roof. And if you notice, there's all these chimneys kind of going around the perimeter. So what the deal was there is that there was a large dance floor in the middle of the place. And then along the perimeter, there was all these private rooms that each had their own private fireplace. I believe, based on my research, this was used for purposes of prostitution, these private rooms. I think they took their cue from the Seattle box houses, which had similar layouts with their cubicles or their boxes, the box houses. So I think that's what was going on. But yeah, this opened in 1926. Gambling, drinking, likely prostitution going on there. So the cops were frequently raiding this place. Finally, in 1922, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department decided that they'd had enough of Mackenzie's Bungalow Inn. So they gathered all their deputies and all their squad cars and paddy wagons and headed over to Mackenzie's and did a large-scale raid. Over 150 people were arrested, including the owners and the employees, and they padlocked the doors. And just a few weeks later, Mackenzie's Roadhouse mysteriously burned down. I love this headline right here. It says, "Racketeering may have caused the second blaze." So that was the end of Mackenzie's Bungalow Inn. Another one on Highway 99, the Jungle Temple number 2. The reason it was called number 2 is because, like Mackenzie's Bungalow Inn, the original Jungle Temple was on the Bothell Highway. It was only in existence for a short period of time before it was shut down. So they moved over to Highway 99, hence the name Jungle Temple number 2. Now, this one, I was talking about how all these roadhouses look so different. This looks like a cabin you'd find out in the woods or something. It looked very primitive. Despite its primitive appearance, though, it was one of the hottest musical venues, especially for jazz. The father of Seattle jazz, Oscar Holden, pictured here, frequently played there. In fact, I think it was the Oscar Holden Trio. They kind of held court at the Jungle Temple number 2. As far as their location, they were on 224th and Highway 99. There's now an Asian supermarket called Ranch 99. So this was located where Ranch 99 basically now sits, on that side of the highway. They managed to stay open until 1934. This was one of the few ones that did not burn down, but they were closed by the police, and I think it turned into another kind of business. I don't believe it burned down. So Jungle Temple number two from 1927 to 1934. Here we got the ranch. So this was opened by Doc Hamilton in 1927. As you can see here, you got his name and likeness on the sign out front. This was located on 220th Street and Highway 99. There's now a Honda dealership there, Linwood Honda, and then across the street from it is a Winco and a Dick's Burgers. But this was where the Honda dealership was basically now located. So yeah, this has one of the longest. This was one of the more storied and longest tenured roadhouses of all the ones on Highway 99. Doc Hamilton opened it in 1927. He actually only owned it for a few months. I believe he opened it in August of 27. And then a few months later, on December 31st, on New Year's Eve, the Snohomish County Sheriff did a large scale raid on Doc Hamilton's place here, as well as four other Highway 99 roadhouses, in an effort to kind of slow them down since so many were opening. Um, After he raided Doc Hamilton's on New Year's Eve, Doc Hamilton basically realized, I just have a big target on my back. Everyone knows who I am. And any kind of, if I try to open a place somewhere, it's just going to gain a lot of attention and the authorities are going to come after me. So he ended up selling the place soon after in early 1928. And after he sold it, it became simply the ranch. It went from Doc Hamilton's barbecue ranch to simply the ranch. Here's a photo of it. Here's kind of a clearer photo of it. As you can see, it was a huge roadhouse. It actually had two different dance floors with two different, bandstands where bands would play. In the middle, there was a big, huge bar, a lot of pool tables, and different gambling equipment. And it was continuously being raided by the cops, but managed to stay open. Now, one of the things that happened here, so Prohibition was repealed in 1933. And when Prohibition was repealed, the Washington State Liquor Control Board immediately opened, immediately formed, and instituted a number of really draconian rules regarding drinking and alcohol. And the reason was because they didn't want to slide back to kind of the crazy days of pre-prohibition, like what was going on in Seattle before prohibition, as well as all the saloons and stuff. So they instituted all kinds of crazy drinking laws. And one of the biggest ones that had the biggest impact was that initially you could only get hard alcohol at a state liquor store. Taverns, bars, nightclubs, restaurants could not serve hard alcohol at all, no mixed drinks. They could only serve beer, wine. And in fact, the beer or wine that they could sell had to initially be 3.2% ABV or lower. Um, by comparison, like a Bud Light, for instance, by comparison, I believe is like a 4.2, 4.4% ABV. So we're talking watered down light beer, which doesn't sound like a lot of fun. And roadhouses, of course, were predicated on the whole idea of having fun. So they quickly figured out a way to get around this rule about no hard alcohol. And what they did is they started allowing customers to bring in their own bottles of booze, and they would just kind of play dumb about it. And at that point, they the terminology kind of changed, and they were less referred to as roadhouses, and they started being referred to as bottle clubs because of this. And again, this was just a way to get around this new law. But they knew exactly what was going on. In fact, they would offer a setup. If you looked at, I have a bunch of old menus of a lot of these old roadhouses, and they advertised their setup. And what a setup was you'd go into these bottle clubs post prohibition, and they'd seat you at your table, and they'd bring you your setup, which was a bowl of ice, a pitcher, two glasses, and whatever mixer you wanted. and you would just pull out your bottle of booze and you'd mix your own drinks for the night. You know, you'd be there all night dancing and drinking and gambling. It was kind of understood that you'd be discreet about your bottle of booze that you carried into the place. You'd usually, place it on the floor or maybe hide it in a purse or something like that. But you just mix your own drinks, and that way, if the liquor agents raided these places, they could just play dumb, and the owners could be like, "Oh, we're not serving alcohol. We don't know anything about this. These people were bringing it in on their own, and we didn't know anything about it." But they knew what was going on. The Ranch was one of these well-known bottle clubs after Prohibition. And this continued on into the 1940s and even into the 1950s. It continued to operate. In the early 50s, it fell under new ownership and they kind of adopted a Central American theme and they became known as El Rancho. But they still offered, floor shows and dancing, and it was still a bottle club. By that point, though, by the early 50s, taste had really changed, especially like with musical taste and stuff. And a lot of these roadhouses or bottle clubs by this point started kind of being viewed as, kind of old and fuddy-duddy. That's where, as far as the younger generation was concerned at this point, that's maybe where their parents went to have a good time or their grandparents, but they were interested in other things. So a lot of the roadhouses closed, or a lot of the bottle clubs closed throughout the 1940s. Only a few were open into the 1950s just because of changing cultural taste. But yeah, El Rancho managed to stay open. As the 1950s progressed, especially as you started reaching the mid 1950s, it became more of a restaurant. They did offer bingo, which was illegal, because not only was it illegal gambling, but the cops were always going there and closing down these bingo games at El Rancho. And one of the main reasons was because a lot of these bingo games at the time were rigged to try to fleece people out of their money. And a lot of older people were going there and playing bingo, and they were losing their savings and stuff at these places. So the cops were continually going to El Rancho, telling them to knock it off with the bingo games. Finally, in 1959, the chief of the Edmonds Police Department paid a personal visit to El Rancho himself and sat everybody down and said, "Look, we've been telling you for years to knock it off with the bingo games. They're illegal. So this is your final warning. If I even so much as hear about another bingo game being played here, we're coming in, we're closing you down, we're arresting you all, throwing you in jail. So final warning. Hopefully you heed my call." And you'll never guess what happened just a few hours after the chief of police paid a visit there. El Rancho was destroyed by a mysterious raging fire. So that was the end of this famous roadhouse. But yeah, it managed to operate from 27 through 1959, so over 3 decades, which was pretty impressive because a lot of them didn't last that long. Um, Here's one near and dear to my heart. So this was the Rosewood Manor. This was actually on 220th Street, and this was the very first roadhouse in the area. This was the first one to open. It actually was built in the early 1900s as a private residence. And then it was sold in around, I would say, 1918. So even before national prohibition, it became the Olympic Tavern. Now I was, so I moved to Edmonds in the late 90s and I bought a house, two houses down from this place on 220th Street. It was a 1940s fixer-upper. And I lived there for probably close to a decade. But as soon as I moved into the neighborhood here, I immediately started hearing places about Rosewood Manor and all just the crazy stories about it. So this was kind of the first thing to appear on my radar as far as roadhouses. This place was kind of what kickstarted my interest in the mythology of roadhouses. Um, but yeah, it basically operated as a speakeasy slash roadhouse throughout Prohibition. It was continuously raided by the cops. After Prohibition, it became a hospital. Then it became an old folks' home. Um, and it kind of went through all kinds of different versions. Sadly, this place was demoed just about 7 months ago in January of this year. It had been vacant and just kind of abandoned for a number of years, and it was basically in really rough condition. So the lot of land it was sold that it sat on was sold to a developer, and they demoed it in January. And word on the street is they're going to probably put in a lot of townhomes, cramming a bunch of townhomes on a lot of land here. But I wrote a piece for it in My Edmonds News when it was torn down that got a lot of traction. Some of you may have read the piece. If not, if you go to My Edmonds News, the archives, you can read about the history of Rosewood Manor here. All right, another roadhouse. This was on Highway 99. This was in the Linwood stretch of Highway 99, so more north than most of these places. This was Rubinac's, opened in 1933. Their motto was drink to the future and forget the past. And indeed, the booze flowed freely here. Here's another picture of what it looked like from outside. But yeah, this was a very typical roadhouse. They also sold chicken dinners. You could go here, gambling, booze. They got raided quite a bit. This place managed to stay open until 1956. I don't remember why they closed. I think it was just changing times, like I was talking about. A lot of these places just kind of fell out of favor and became, just lost their popularity that they once had. And I think it became a restaurant or something like that. So that was Rubinac's. The Oasis. This opened in 1931. This was on 137th and Highway 99, so in the shoreline stretch of 99. Um, this was your typical bottle club and dance hall. It was pretty popular. They had a lot of live music here. Here's a menu for the Oasis from my personal collection. Um, it managed to stay open through the 1940s. In 1947, an article came out that announced that the IRS was placing a lien on the Oasis due to years of unpaid taxes. And you guys will be shocked to learn that just a couple weeks later, it burned down in a mysterious fire, another mysterious fire after the place closed. That's what I mean about arsons. A lot of these places, this is how they met their demise. So that was the Oasis. Again, that was open from 1931 through 1947. This is a place that is still open. Melby's opened up as Melby's Tavern in 1933. Even though it was operating as a legal tavern, it was roadhouse-esque in that it was basically a bottle club. A lot of they sold booze and stuff from this place, and so the cops were paying frequent visits there. This is on this basically the north shoreline, South Edmond stretch of Highway 99. It's now Woody's Tavern. You can still see it. Um, Interesting. So the current owner of Woody's has really embraced the history of this place. And if you go inside, he has an entire wall of just great photographs and newspaper clippings and stuff talking about the history of this place. One of the things I do in addition to doing a lot of writing is I co-host a podcast known as Dim Lights and Stiff Drinks, the Dive Bars of Seattle, where we visit different historic drinking establishments and go over the history of these places. One of the places we covered was Woody's Tavern, and he took us on a tour of this place. And on the main floor here, there's a big rug that kind of covers the main floor where the bar is located. And if you lift up the rug, there's a trap door in the floor with like a secret room underneath. And the common belief is that that's where they were storing the booze and stuff during its bottle club days. So Melby's Tavern, now Woody's Tavern. This is a bit of a mystery for me. So this is a menu I found, I think at an estate sale a number of years ago, located on Highway 99. As we can see here from the cover, it has this very ambiguous name, The Spot. There's no address given, but it makes sure to advertise that it's open all night. And then in the circle here, we see what looks like a pair of, women's legs here. So, if we put everything together, it's open all night, the women's legs, the ambiguous name, I think we can all pick up what they're putting down, or can we? This is the interior of the menu. And we realize very quickly that what we thought was the women's legs was actually the hindquarters of these two pigs. And this is just a regular menu. But I believe this is just subterfuge because I think what was really going on is what was insinuated on the cover here. But I don't know. I've been trying to find out anything I can about this place. So far, I've been unsuccessful. So if any of you tuning in tonight that are watching this know anything about this spot place, the spot that was on Highway 99, probably late 1920s, 1930s, somewhere around there, reach out to me. Let me know. I'd love to learn more about this spot. But again, I think this was just subterfuge. I think this is probably what was really going on at the spot. All right, and our last roadhouse for the night. This is Chinaland. This opened in 1935 on the shoreline stretch of Highway 99. This was your typical, dance place. They had big band music, and people would go there, and it was a bottle club. You'd bring your own bottle there, and they'd give you the setup and stuff. And this place is actually still open. You probably know it better by its iteration as the Drift On Casino in Roadhouse. It's still open. I believe it's now the Aurora Borealis. It's a gambling place. They also offer live music and stuff. So it's still going strong. And that concludes my presentation tonight. Here's the cover for my Lost Roadhouses book, which is, as Nathan mentioned, is available there at the library if you want to learn more about the roadhouses. So with that, I guess I'll hand it back to Nathan, and he will start taking questions from people. So if anyone has a question, let Nathan know, and then Nathan, you could just let me know, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot, Brad. That was really entertaining and interesting. Um, yeah, they've been adding questions throughout the presentation, and Robin's
Great.
been getting them for me. Let's take a look and see what we got. I might have to do a little adjusting to the questions. Let me just review here.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe I'll change a question from Mary a teeny bit. She's asking kind of like, what was the state of mind towards drinking? Was there an obsession? How did it differ in Seattle versus other cities around the country?
Well, I think the how alcohol was viewed during Prohibition was probably universal across the country. It was forbidden, and whenever anything is forbidden, suddenly it becomes the forbidden fruit, and everybody wants to do it. So drinking actually increased. That's kind of the irony of Prohibition. It was to stamp out alcohol and all these drinking establishments, but it did the opposite. It just increased. I know alcoholism, from what I've read, actually the rates of alcoholism increased, the rates of drinking increased, and they don't call it the Roaring Twenties for nothing.
Right. Okay, that's great. Let's see. So there's a few from Kirsten. I'm gonna have to combine those a little bit later. Here's one from Claire, though. I'll let you have a shot at it. How did the doctors see alcohol? Were they all just pushing it, or was it a real prescription? How do they really see alcohol?
I don't know. I think a lot of them had dollar signs in their eyes. I think, you know, we now know today that alcohol is pretty toxic and is pretty harmful to the body, especially, if you're doing more than moderate consumption, can be very damaging to the health. I don't think they had that medical knowledge back then. I think people saw firsthand what alcoholism was doing to people and what excessive drinking was doing. And I'm sure the doctors were aware of that. But again, when Washington State went dry and they had that loophole that doctors could prescribe medicinal whiskey, I think a lot of doctors suddenly saw a big boom in their business and got dollar signs in their eyes. So even the doctors that knew it was probably harmful were willing to overlook it for the fact that they were suddenly making a lot of money. A lot of patients were suddenly coming to them asking for prescriptions of this medicinal alcohol.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, right.
Um, yeah. All right. So Mary and I think there was a second person, Mary, and then later Al, both were interested. Was there any involvement with Whidbey Island, or have you ever heard anything about Baby Island being used as a drop-off point, or anything involving Whidbey Island?
Yeah, Whidbey Island was one of the drop-off points for Prohibition. I wish I would have included it. Somewhere I have a map showing all the drop-off points that rum runners used coming down from, the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the different water routes like that. And yeah, Whidbey Island was one of the drop-off points for sure. I don't know. I don't think there was a lot of like bootlegging going on Whidbey Island. I think it was pretty rural at that point, but certainly it was a drop-off point because it was so rural. So I think it was common for that reason.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just moved from Whidbey Island a few months ago. I lived there for about 5 years. Let's
Okay.
see. So let me try and synthesize Kirsten's information. So first of all, she says, hi, and she loves your work, and she wants
Oh,
to
okay.
know anything you might know about what happened, or anything that you know about Chris Hartwig.
That name sounds familiar. Chris Hart.
Because so here's what she claims. She said he
Okay.
distributed booze and around South Seattle during Prohibition. He's my great great grandfather. And
Oh,
then she
okay.
she points out I also lived at Rosewood Manor for a couple years.
Oh, wow. Cool. Cool. Where
So
I wonder if there was a church group that lived there, kind of a church fellowship group that lived there at the same time I did, and they were awesome. They took really good care of the place, and they kind of like refurbished and restored it and brought it back to life. And it was a really cool place while they lived there. So I'm just curious if maybe she was there during those years.
yeah, we'll
Um,
see. We'll see if she chimes in with a little more info on that.
yeah,
Since you bring that
yeah.
up.
Anyway, as far as the person she brought up, I've heard the name, but I don't know a lot about him. He may have even been connected, been part of Olmsted's gang because he had, colleagues that worked for him that were kind of spread out and they would accept shipments of booze at different places. So he might have been one of those people. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was really surprised, by the way, when you mentioned the number of employees. I was like, what?
Yeah.
That's
It was
incredible.
it was huge. It was a huge operation. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. So here's a kind of a different direction question. Long after Prohibition, Claire wants to know, many Washington wine businesses designated the summer season to commemorate how wine has socially impacted the state. Do you know why the month of August was chosen for that? Do you know anything about that?
That's a great question. No, I don't. I don't know why August was chosen. I don't know if there was something significant happened in the wine industry. Um, I don't know a lot about the wine history in Washington State. A lot of my colleagues at History Link do. In fact, they've been writing this past year. In fact, they've been trying to chronicle the history of Washington State wine history in Washington State. So I don't know a lot about it, but I would encourage anybody that has questions like that about wine, and that's a great question to maybe check out History Link. You just go to historylink.org and
Oh,
type in wine in the search. Chances are high that an article will pop up that will probably answer your question. But I'm
yeah.
sorry, I don't have the answer to that. It's a good
Just as
question.
a quick aside, one of the other people in the audience named Jeffries is also pointing out that August is typically harvest time for grapes. So
Oh, there you go.
maybe it's just that.
That
Okay,
could
so
be
a
it.
couple of people are asking about roadhouses that weren't gone over in this presentation. So here's one from someone, Karen, wants to know, there a roadhouse called Spanish Castle, and where was it?
Yeah, yeah, there was Spanish Castle. In fact, Jimi Hendrix wrote a song about it. So, Spanish Castle. So, in addition to the two stretches of highway north of Seattle, the Bothell Highway and Highway 99, there was also an early stretch of highway connecting basically Seattle to Tacoma, the early Pacific Highway or the Federal Way Highway. It operated under different names. But a number of roadhouses for the same reasons as the ones north of Seattle also opened south of the city on that stretch of highway.
Hmm.
And Spanish Castle was one of them. It started out as a roadhouse and then it became a very popular music venue that continued through the 1960s. A lot of the top musical acts of the day from the throughout the 50s and 60s played there. And Jimi Hendrix, that's where he got exposed to rock music. That's where he saw a lot of his early shows. And he wrote a song about the Spanish Castle. I think it's
Hmm.
called Spanish Castle,
I'll have to
kind
check
of
that out. I don't know
in
if I've heard
tribute
it.
to this place. So yeah, the Spanish Castle was a very well-known roadhouse south of the city. Yeah.
And I think this is probably the same Karen. She's asking about whether you know anything about Parker's Ballroom, and she thinks it's in Shoreline.
Yeah, yeah, Parker's Ballroom. Um, that I'm trying to remember when Parker's opened. It I want to say it opened in the 30s. It mostly operated as a music venue, but I think it was a bottle club for a while. I don't think it was too as shady as some of the other roadhouses. In other words, I don't think you'd go in Parker's, and I don't think there was gambling or
Hmm.
prostitution or anything like that. But I think they allowed people to bring in their own bottles of booze and in the early years and probably offered a setup to them and stuff, but it was mostly known as a music venue. And that Parker's remained open through what was it the 90s? I don't remember the exact year. It was sometime in the early 90s it finally closed down. I caught a couple shows there.
Interesting. I think
Yeah.
this is the same person. John again is curious. I don't know if you've got any info on this. We'll find out. I've heard rumors that there are tunnels from Smuggler's Cove up to what used to be the restaurant
Hmm.
Charles at Smuggler's Cove. Why? Why are there tunnels if you know anything about that?
Yeah, so Smuggler Mukilteo was a popular drop-off spot. And yeah, there were so yeah, they would basically drop the booze off, and then they'd hike up a little hill, and they had built tunnels that went in and went up into this restaurant. It wasn't a I don't think it was a roadhouse, but they were able to like bring booze up into this place, and I think local bootleggers would go in, and it was a place where they can kind of be sneaky about getting their shipments of booze. The restaurant, I want to say it's still open or it's under new owners. And just recently, I want to say within the past few years, they were renovating the place, and there was an old oil furnace down in the basement that they just wanted to get rid of because it had been long out of operation. And they moved this furnace, and it revealed this opening to one of these tunnels.
Hmm.
So the kind of the mythology of it is still kind of ongoing. They're still discovering things about it. Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. So here's one from Dan. I think what Dan's asking is intuitively likely, but he's asking about data. So I've heard that prohibition was successful in that domestic violence, on the job injuries, and absenteeism all went down significantly. Do you have any data on that to kind of back that up?
No, I've heard anecdotally similar things, but I don't have any like hard data where I can share with you to support that or not. I've
Yeah,
heard similar things.
I would kind of just wonder about the data even being available. I just don't even know what they would have. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of more anecdotal, but I don't know if maybe they did a study at some point to really study, the rates of, like you were saying, workplace injuries and things related to drinking.
okay. So I think we got maybe time for one or two more.
Okay.
So here's one. It's kind of interesting. I've heard rumors, and this person isn't known who it was. I've heard rumors that Al Capone had financed a lot of rum running operations, including Smuggler's Cove in the Northwest. Any truth to that?
No, that would be cool, but I'm pretty sure that's an urban legend. I'd heard that before, but I found nothing to back that up, nothing to support that. So I think it was just kind of an urban legend that got started somehow and
Sure.
should survive. But I don't believe that is true.
Okay. So here's a question from me now. I was down in Ballard on Saturday for the first time in quite a long time. And as you're probably aware, most of you and Brad, there's a ton of breweries in Ballard. It's like brewery
Yeah,
town.
yeah,
And I'm just thinking the difference with the cultural acceptance and the attitude towards alcohol is like night and day compared to
yeah.
then and now. What do you think? people back then could learn from how we treat it now? Like, what are we doing right with regards to alcohol, and what could we maybe do with other things in the future, like we were treating alcohol, like with marijuana or magic mushrooms? Like, what do you think we could learn from how we regulate alcohol today and how it didn't work back then, the way they tried to deal with it through prohibition, and how much more effective it is, and now we're getting tax money and stuff out of it? What do you think? What do you think about all that?
Well, it's kind of an interesting time. So as far as drinking itself goes, it's actually kind of having a moment right now, kind of like what happened with smoking a number of years back, where suddenly there's a lot of information and data that's coming out about how harmful it is to your health. And a lot of people are cutting back on their drink. And I think we saw, probably a spike during COVID, if I had to venture a guess, is the way people have kind of coping with what was going on. But in the last couple of years, there's been a sharp, I've seen studies showing that there's been a sharp decrease in drinking. And with particular, you mentioned all the breweries and stuff. A lot of them are starting to shut down. So what has started happening is there was so many breweries, they became so popular that so many opened, but they lost kind of their novelty factor, and people are drinking less now because of health related issues. And so a lot of breweries are kind of closing. So the alcohol industry is kind of having a bad moment right now
Uh,
as a result of this, because alcohol sales and stuff like that are starting to kind of take somewhat of a nosedive. That's not to say suddenly drinking is going to be non-existent. I don't think it's going to go quite the way of cigarettes, but there is the public perception of booze right now is kind of undergoing a change. That's probably a good thing. Um, but as far as like what happened with prohibition and stuff, I think the lesson, the walkaway lesson that a lot of people came with, if you try to, and we saw this with marijuana too, if you try to prohibit something, that's just gonna want people are gonna want it more. So I think what they're doing with the psychedelic mushrooms and the marijuana and certainly alcohol for a long time is, yeah, they're allowing it, they're taxing it, and they're letting the public make their own decisions if this is something they want to do or not. And then once that happens, usually kind of the novelty factor of it wears off, and it's not such a forbidden fruit that people want to do as much as they can. We're seeing that with alcohol right now. So that was a good question.
Great. Thanks a lot, Brad. Well, we'll conclude with that then. And
Okay.
thank you so much for the presentation, Brad. And thank you, everyone in our audience, for joining this evening and for submitting your questions. I hope you enjoyed this program, and everyone have a good night.
Thank you, everybody.